Hey everybody, Relay here. Welcome to another segment of Flop or Not. And today we've got something incredibly special. None other than the 2023 GOTY, Baldur's Gate 3. For those of you that are somehow unaware of the title, Baldur's Gate 3 is a tactical RPG, so a TRPG, developed and published by Larian Studios. This is a sequel to the much older Baldur's Gate 1 and 2 games that were also tactical RPGs, but not to be confused with Baldur's Gate 1 and 2 Dark Alliance, which were both not tactical RPGs. Baldur's Gate 3 has been massively successful, and they've sold to date about 21 million units of the game, which is incredible, and it's an introduction to a lot of new players which, might not have been familiar with tactical RPGs beforehand, so it's bringing more players to the genre, which is also nice to see. While we're still in the intro, I'd like to touch on character customization. The character customization is fair, although it's not abundant with its options for choosing the particulars of the facial features as well as your body. So with the face, you're able to customize through certain presets of face shapes, as well as your eye color and your hair type, hair color, and skin tone, the regular stuff like that. But other than that, you can't go into the fine details like change the ridge of the nose or adjust the height of the eyebrows, adjust how large the eyes are, the cheekbones, etc. They're preset. Now for the body, the same applies. It's even more restricted, as a matter of fact. You only really get to choose between a small build or a large build, like a large frame or small frame. So we're a little limited in terms of the customization, but nonetheless, the character models are perfectly fine. That being said, this area is also where you choose your race and your sub-race, and this will determine not only how you look, but also what you're proficient in terms of weapons, armor, and the skills / actions that you have. You'll then go on to choose your class, which kind of determines how your playstyle is going to be, whether it's wizard, rogue, barbarian, etc., and as well as your background, which gives you additional skills. Towards the end of the character customization, you can fine-tune certain abilities up to a certain limit, and from there your character is pretty well made. Moving on now to environment. The environment is fairly vast and diverse in terms of different locations, from fields and jungles to caverns, dungeons, enemy camps, and even cities, and whatever the hell this is. The locations are plentiful, to say the least. There's an abundance of secret locations that can be easily missed if you're not paying attention properly, which is kind of cool, honestly, that they have that much depth into their map design. What really brings this game to life, though, are the sheer amount of interactable NPCs. It's almost endless. And they often actually add like either a goofy element or even a functional element to the game, like not just generic conversations, which is incredible to see. The amount of voice acting that had to go into this is insane. I'm not just talking to other characters, NPCs that are alive. You can speak to the dead in this game, as well as animals, and some of the animals have some pretty wild stories to tell you, and as well as the dead usually offer you some pretty useful information towards your current quest. So for those of you looking at getting this right now, you'll be glad to know that the locations feel alive. There's always somewhere to explore, always secrets to find, and a plethora of interactables, whether it be objects, NPCs, animals, speaking to the dead people. There's so much to do, it's incredible. So the locations are never truly dead, which is hard to do in a game that has this much content. Furthermore, to add to this interactable environment, you can build relationships with your party members, which kind of enhance the overall experience, making the game feel a touch more personal. And these party members often have their own quests relating to their character development, which brings you to areas that you probably wouldn't even be able to access without them. Now, for those of you who care, each character, individual party member, has their own relationship with the player. So there's a relationship gauge, which when you do things that the character in question approves of, then you will kind of heighten your relationship status with that character. And that can lead to some pretty interesting scenarios.
Take off your clothes.
On the flip side of the coin, however, it's worth noting that the weather is pretty much always the same. There's never any change in weather conditions. It's never, raining or snowing, and which would have been an interesting mechanic for Larian to introduce, because it could have created like modifiers to the terrain. It could have, made certain, if it's cloudy out, it could have been, you could be occluded a bit more when you're doing your stealth actions. If it's snowing or raining, the terrain could have been affected negatively, that would reduce movement speed. Like, they could have incorporated certain things like that, I find. Another thing worth noting is that you have the ability to toggle free roaming into turn-based actions during any time in the game, except for when you are engaged in a battle, in which case it locks you into tactical mode, which, I mean, it's as expected. It's a tactical RPG, but I figured I'd just mention that. And as if the interactable NPCs and the locations weren't enough, there is a plethora of side quests throughout the game that are often beneficial in terms of like just overall rewards and loot, but it can also tie in with the main storyline at times and help you out in a main quest. Moving on now to the details and graphics. So the characters are generally pretty well polished, and the surrounding areas, while roaming, they look pretty good. And rather sharp. I don't know if it's a hardware thing or not, but with the Radeon 6900 XT, which is what I'm using, there's occasional texture popping and occasional kind of visual bugs. So there are a few characters who, when I was talking to in the game, especially in Act 3, which I hear a lot of people have been having a hard time with, they just didn't pop up. So there's a djinn, which is like a genie in this one part, and there's a hamster, which is supposed to be on somebody's shoulder, which never really loaded for me, so it was just a little awkward in those scenarios. Other than that, the effects during the battles are well animated, especially the spells. They look really nice, and some of the abilities are pretty flashy too, so there's plenty to look at in the battles. While we're on the subject of graphics, it's important to note that this supports both DLSS for NVIDIA cards and FSR for both NVIDIA, Radeon, and as well Intel, so it's got quite a bit of support for upscaling and the other features that come with both DLSS and FSR. Another thing to note is that if you revisit locations where you've slaughtered a group of people, be prepared to not get jump scared, because they do all load back in, and sometimes they make the death sound all at once, which catches you off guard, so just be wary of that. Moving on now to the story. It basically goes like this. I'm not going to spoil everything, but I'll give you the general plot line. So the Illithid, which are like a certain enemy, it's a type of being, a mind flayer, and the Absolute, which is like the boss of the Illithid, are attacking Faerun, which is the world you're in. Now you get abducted and you're infected with what's called a tadpole, which is basically the way that the mind flayers kind of spread their population. The tadpole gradually turns you into one of them. So essentially, you spend the majority of the game seeking a cure for the tadpole, and you're trying to avoid turning into an Illithid under the enemy's control. Now eventually you come to a point where the story can take a lot of different turns due to yourself as the player, your own actions. So it's really a true RPG experience. You can choose to kind of be the bad guy or be the good guy, and there's a lot of different routes you can take. So without spoiling anything, just know that your decisions do end up counting eventually. As you progress further in the game, the plot shifts to not only wanting to cure yourself of the tadpole, but to destroy the Absolute and prevent what's called the Grand Design. So the Grand Design is, in a nutshell, the conquer and conversion of humanoid creatures into mind flayers in order to conquer all of Faerun and likely other planets after that. And that's pretty well the story and the plot. In terms of battle mechanics now, being an RPG that's tactical, there's a lot to discuss. Before the battle even begins, you can actually set yourself up to be in the advantage. If you know there's a battle coming up, you have a wide variety of potions, elixirs, and oils which will help you ahead of the battle. These potions can range from an invisibility potion to an elixir of strength, and certain oils you can use to coat your blade in poison and give it certain additional attributes. On top of that, if you're able to get access to the area without being spotted, you can plant what are called smoke powder barrels, and these smoke powder barrels act like bombs. So essentially you lure the enemy to you, and once they get close enough within a radius, you blow up that smoke powder barrel and it'll create a large radius of explosion and deal damage to everybody surrounding it. And those are just a couple of ways that you can get ahead prior to even entering the fight to give yourself a better fighting chance against the enemy. Now upon entering the fight, there are so many different aspects to how you can approach it that I can't possibly cover them all. But before we get to abilities, I want to talk about throwables. So throwables are incredibly overlooked in Baldur's Gate 3, and there is no reason why they should be, because they actually give you such a great benefit. So they can either be used to deal damage, for example, a smoke powder bomb or a acid vial, or they can be used to change the terrain. So a grease bottle, for example, if you throw that on the ground, it makes the ground slick and slippery, so people who are on there have a chance to go prone. and it's also flammable. But on the other hand, and a lot of people don't really know this too much, you can actually throw potions at downed players, and as long as it's in that vicinity of that player, it will revive the player and heal them simultaneously, which is an incredible use for a throwable. You can also throw weapons like daggers and such, but I didn't really get too far into that. So just try to use your throwables because they're super useful. There are also one-time use items. So I give the example of scrolls because you can find many of them throughout the game. And scrolls can really help you when you're in a really tough spot. Even your player, if you're a different class, you're not a mage or a sorceress or a cleric, you can still use scrolls as a rogue or as a fighter and get great benefits from it. So especially the higher level scrolls, the AoE scrolls can be huge in boss fights and can kind of turn the tide in your favor. So scrolls are an excellent use, and I recommend that you stockpile them religiously in this game. And like I mentioned earlier, there's also potions, elixirs, and oils that you can coat your weapons in. But those are all usable items, and it's important to tell you that usable items actually use up either an action or a bonus action. So this is what we're going to get into next. We're going to get into the actions and the cost of doing certain things. So each player, regardless of their situation, some have more, some have less, but generally each player has 2 actions that they can take every turn. So one being an actual action and the other being a bonus action. So these bonus actions are usually not the same. They can't use the same abilities as your main action. They're usually reserved for like drinking a potion or using the bonus skill hide or jumping, for example, and even the offhand attack is a bonus action. Now for actions are the scrolls, one-time use scrolls, any spell or ability that you use with your character. Those are a primary action, and that will use your action slot up. And generally after you've exhausted both your action and your bonus action, your turn is pretty well done because you can't really make any more moves. So with that being said, know that some of your usables or your throwables, for example, will be main actions, and just drinking a potion, however, would be a bonus action. So just be aware that they will take out one or the other, and you may be left without a move afterwards. That being said, moving on to the main beef of the combat system. So the system relies on advantages, disadvantages, weaknesses, immunities, and resistances. So touching with the advantage and disadvantage system, essentially when you put your enemy at a disadvantage using some kind of status effect, either you blind them or they're on not great terrain for them, so like ice for example, they are put at a disadvantage, which means that you have a higher chance of dealing a higher amount of damage on them and generally a higher chance of landing an attack at all. However, that is also true for the enemy. If the enemy puts you in a disadvantage, for example, they cast darkness on you and you can't see through the dark, then you're at a disadvantage. Or if you're threatened, you're at a disadvantage, so they will have a higher chance of doing the same to you. So it's important to try to leverage that advantage system in your favor. And there are actually certain skills that can only be used once you have an advantage. For example, sneak attack, for both rogues that I have in my party, rely heavily on you having an advantage over the enemy, and that's how you can use it. If you don't have an advantage, you can't use it, and that's like the bread and butter for the rogue. It deals the most damage of any other attack you have on that character. And that's why I'm putting so much emphasis on it. Now let's talk about the resistances, the immunities, and the weaknesses of the enemy. So enemies, once you examine them, they have either a resistance, an immunity, or a weakness to a certain type of damage. Could be elemental damage, could be piercing, bludgeoning, slashing, etc. So this will give you good information on what to use and what not to use against the enemy. For example, if the enemy has immunity to fire or poison, you're obviously not going to cast that because it will deal nothing on them every time. But they could also be weak to psychic, for example, or some other element, and it'll give you good hints as to how to approach that enemy. So playing around that mechanic is key, and it'll allow you to maximize your damage output. I also want to let you know that you have something called weapon proficiency in this game, which is related to your character's stats and basically tells you what you're proficient in terms of weapons, and it covers a wide variety of weapons. So just make sure that you're using the weapon that you're most proficient with for the best results, as if you're not proficient with the weapon and you're using it, you'll notice that you don't really have access to the abilities that come with that weapon. So just keep that in mind because it could be vital for your character. Lastly, always keep an eye out for the environmental mechanics in the battles. There are many battles where you have like wine barrels just sitting around that are highly flammable, so leverage those to your advantage. Even like smoke powder barrels sometimes are just sitting around, and try to use that to your advantage if you can, because they will provide you with additional damage output if you play your cards right. Getting into spells now. So spells are generally under 2 categories, at least I call it that. So you have spells that require no concentration and spells that require concentration. So the spells that don't require concentration are generally the spells that don't linger on the battlefield. For example, Fireball or Shocking Grasp or Magic Missile. And what that means is that these spells can't really be interrupted unless your enemy has some kind of item that allows them to interrupt spells. On the other hand, if you're using a spell that's concentration, such as Insect Plague or Cloud Kill or Fog Cloud, all of these linger on the battlefield and deal damage per turn. But the thing with that is that if the enemy attacks you and you don't roll a saving throw, which is basically a mechanic that involves a little bit of luck in addition to your level of skill against the type of attack that was used against you, then you will lose concentration, and as a result the spell that's supposed to be like a AoE spell that lingers on the field will also dissipate to nothing. So for example, if you're in an area that you know you might take damage next turn, it may be wise to not cast a spell that requires concentration, because immediately next turn the enemy will deal damage and potentially knock you off of your concentration. So just useful things to keep in mind. Moving ahead with the next category, let's talk about difficulty. It's kind of irrelevant that I talk about this because the game itself has a difficulty slider, so it'll allow you to play based on your skill level. But even being on normal, I actually had a bit of a hard time, especially earlier on with certain mob fights and boss fights. But I believe it was due to just party configuration, which is where I think it'll vary the most for people. So obviously having 2 rogues in the party with 2 mages isn't a super great configuration. Not the worst, but not the greatest. So during boss fights, for example, I had no one to tank damage. So whereas if you had like a barbarian or a fighter, you'd have somebody a bit more beefy. And I found later on in the game when I switched that I had a lot better result and the battles were going a lot smoother. So a lot of the difficulty can come from your own party if it's incorrectly configured. Now, on top of that, I did find the boss battles fun and challenging, and some of them had certain elements that made them quite a bit more challenging. For example, there's this one boss fairly late game that deals a stupendous amount of damage, and she continuously gets protected by this shield and multiple layers of it due to another enemy in the map, which I failed to correct. But if you would have taken that out, it would have made the boss fight much easier because she would have stopped getting that many shields every time it came around to be her turn. So there are certain things during boss battles that you can do to make your life easier, so always be on the lookout for items in the environment and deal with those first before the boss itself. Boss battles aside, mob encounters can be tough, but are generally a lot more manageable, and they shouldn't be too much of a struggle. What I do like that I feel like not many people would agree with is that the game implements a level cap for your character at around level 12. So once you get to level 12, you can no longer level up, meaning that you can't become overpowered above the enemies in this game, which is actually something I quite respect because it preserves the challenge of the game itself. Moving on now towards the final category, let's talk about equipment and gear customization. So with the armor, you have helmets, boots, gloves or gauntlets, a cape, amulet, rings, and potentially a shield if you count that as armor. For a weapon, you can have 2 on-hand weapons or just a 2-hander or even just a regular single-handed weapon. And the game follows the same formula as many RPGs before it in terms of like the rarity rating system. So you have white being the most common and you have orange being legendary or the most rare. Now, associated with rareness is generally considered to be a better item because these rare items, especially the legendaries and the epic items, come with better abilities that usually deal higher damage or have better perks and better armor rating as well. I just want to note that if you're mid-battle, be aware if you do change a piece of equipment, it does count as an action mid-battle. So try not to screw yourself over that way. But as you build your gear, try to make it complementary to your class's abilities. For example, I'm rogue, and as a rogue, you are greatly relying on the fact that you can have an advantage against the enemy. That way you can use your sneak attack, which is the highest damaging attack that you have. So I always try to make sure I had fog cloud on my character and a few other pieces of equipment that allowed me to go invisible and leverage my sneak attack to the fullest potential. Sometimes equipment even have other uses outside of combat, which involve amulets that allow you to speak with the dead, for example, and there's a certain kind of side quest that you can unlock by finding a certain amulet called a sentient amulet, and well, without spoiling it, it's a pretty interesting quest. So here we are at the verdict. Does Baldur's Gate 3 flop or does it not? This game could not be possibly any further away from a flop. It simply excels in too many aspects for it to be even considered nothing less than a success. It won Game of the Year 2023 for a reason. The game is massive and incredibly engaging, and it's just enhanced by the characters that you meet along the way that'll join your party, and you really feel like you're involved. There's an incredible amount of side quests to do, random encounters, secret locations that even though I have 160 hours in my one playthrough, I have missed, and it's insane how they can cram so much content into one game. Like, this is what gaming should be like, you know, no DLCs, no expansion, the full game at release, and that's impressive in its own, and it's sad to say, but it's true. The game is visually attractive with the occasional bug or texture pop in. There's loads of customization in weapons and abilities, as well as your class and your skills, and I consider it to be one of my favorite games to date. It has a way of keeping you interested, and despite the fact that some people might not like the tactical gameplay because maybe they have to think a bit harder, the game has a way of getting you so involved into what's happening, and you're just enjoying every second of the exploration aspect and finding different things to do. You really get lost in it. That being said, Baldur's Gate 3 is a true gem amongst the AAA releases that we see nowadays. Whether or not you actually like tactical role-playing games, you can't deny that the amount of passion that Larian poured into it is palpable. The voice acting alone is greater than any recent AAA title. It's incredible. So that being said, you get to choose your own adventure with the choices you make, and you know, it is the embodiment of what makes an RPG an RPG. You can alter the whole course of the game by choosing certain options, and that's really choosing your own path. Feel free to comment, like, dislike, and subscribe if you want to see more content like this. Thanks for watching, and take her easy.